Hi, everybody. I hope this finds you and your families well. For this week's podcast, I'd like to talk about self-forgiveness. After my last one, which was on the theme of forgiveness in general, a number of listeners, including students from Fordham Prep, asked for a reflection on self-forgiveness. I think this is something a lot of us struggle with, and it's not clear how we go about it, so I'd like to share with you a few reflections on this. Self-forgiveness is predicated on our willingness to be as compassionate to ourselves as we would be to another person. I find we can be hardest on ourselves. Our harshest words of shame and criticism and blame can be on ourselves. We say things to ourselves we would not say to our worst enemies. I think we don't know how to ask for self-forgiveness. This is not something that we hear in preaching at church. It's not a part of our religious education. It's not a part of our spiritual tradition. I mean, we don't hear about it. But if we are not able to have self-forgiveness, we get trapped in a cycle of self-punishment. Not forgiving ourselves imprisons us in patterns of shame, unhealthy guilt, self-retribution, and self-pity that is lacking in self-love can also lead to self-harming. Sometimes this can seem easier. Self-harm can be easier than doing the hard work of forgiveness. Because forgiveness requires facing uncomfortable realities. And it requires courage. We're going into darkness. We're going into wound. We have to revisit some things that were painful to us. We have to face them head on. That's hard. And so it's understandable that there is resistance to that. Another reality that might be helpful in recognizing is that each of us is a complex, paradoxical mystery. One perspective on this is that I am more than just my ego. I am more than just that part of me that's awake and conscious and taking everything in. The reality is that I am a mixture of complex voices inside of me. There are many parts of my personality. Sometimes these voices can act autonomously. Sometimes they're so powerful that they can influence us or make decisions for us. I think the next podcast I do will be on this inner committee. But for now, the ones that are most relevant to us might be what I call the liar, the saboteur, and the superego. Again, these are all voices or energies that are at work inside of us. The liar is a voice that says, no matter what you do, it's never good enough. This is a shaming voice. The saboteur is a voice that pops up whenever we're about to do something that will be transformative or potentially will help us to grow. It's a voice that says, oh, that's not going to work. Why don't you just stay home? Don't go to that class. Don't go to that lecture. Don't do this. Don't go to that meeting. Because it knows that we're going to grow from this, and it wants us to stay where we are. I think deep down, there's a very powerful part of us that does not want to change. Because to change means to transform, to become a new person. But we might have to reorganize our personality. That's hard work. It takes energy. Things won't be the same. And something in us says, let's just stay with what we know. We might be torturing ourselves, but let's just stay here. This will be easier. And then there's the superego. That's the part of us that's all the shoulds and I need to. I should do this. I should have done that. I should have anticipated this. I should have done that differently. None of these things are the voice of God. That's the thing. The liar, the saboteur, that is not the voice of God. And sometimes we think it is. We think that shaming voice is God telling us we're not good enough. When we hear those voices come up, I think we want to turn to God and say, help me to hear your voice of truth. And the voice of truth, the voice of God, is always going to be leading us to freedom and to being more embracive, more forgiving, more merciful. It's going to lead us into light, not into dark places. So again, we forgive ourselves for being a complexity and for acting out of unconscious motivations. part of our task in this is making the journey to ever greater consciousness, because then we're more free. And when we hear the voice of the liar or the saboteur popping up, we can say, I hear this. This is not the voice of God, and I can now make a decision as to whether I'm going to act out of this or not. Am I going to listen to this or not? Let's explore some common resistances to self-forgiveness. We tend to deny many of the unavoidable givens of the human experience. And when we're faced with these quote-unquote givens, we say, if I worked hard enough, if I tried hard enough, if I were getting it right, I should be able to overcome these things. The reality is, this is a part of the human condition. And these will not change for anybody. And we have to learn how to navigate them. For example, an unavoidable given is that everything changes and ends. Nothing is lasting. Nothing will last forever. Another, things don't always go according to plan. Our best laid plans, our hard work, can sometimes be wrecked by unforeseen circumstances. History is notoriously unsympathetic to our hopes and dreams. Sometimes things just happen that are beyond our control. Look at the situation we're in now with the COVID-19 crisis. A lot of carefully laid plans and hard work was wrecked because of this random thing, this turn that history took. And that's nothing that we can control. That's beyond us. Another reality, life is not always fair. Pain is a part of life. If we try to deny or avoid necessary pain and suffering, we will create more pain and suffering. Also, people, including you and I, are not loving and loyal all the time. We fail in that. Another unavoidable reality, we can't carry the burden alone. We can't assume responsibility for everything. Ultimately, we're invited to come to a place where we say, I'm powerless. I am not God. And I desperately need God. And I can only make this work with God's grace and my willingness to cooperate with it. Again, there's will and grace. So the invitation is to rely on God's grace and God's desire to work with us and to respond to that. I think there can also be a tendency to romanticize the past and fantasize about how good the old days were. If I could just return to that age of innocence, things were so much simpler back then. Well, I don't know about that. Maybe we just weren't as aware and awake. And I think that we also have a tendency, as I said, just to romanticize what it was like in the past. Here's reality. The moment that we have to reorient our life to the reality that we're in now. There's also a temptation to impatience when it comes to the process of forgiveness. We have to be willing to wait in this container to do the work. It's done on God's time, not on our time. This is humbling, and it might require relearning lessons and beginning again and again and again. This is how transformation happens. It's 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 5 steps forward, 10 steps back, 100 steps forward, 50 back. But in that whole journey, something is happening. Something is going on. We can't always sense it, and we can't always see, well, what's the result? What's happening? That will take time to become more clear. There's nothing we can do when it comes to forgiveness to control the process, to set a timetable for it, to manipulate it, to orchestrate a certain outcome. That's going to be up to God more than us. Let's talk about healthy guilt and unhealthy guilt. In recent decades, there's been a trend toward getting rid of all guilt, like guilt is a bad thing. Well, unhealthy guilt's a bad thing, but if we don't have guilt, we don't have conscience. Let's start with unhealthy guilt. Unhealthy guilt that comes from the liar. That's the voice that moves me toward a loss of self-esteem. It evokes shame and leads to isolation. It's a voice that says, I am bad. I'm never good enough. It creates hostility toward the self. It moves toward depression and anxiety. Sometimes childhood structures, including religion, can give us unhealthy guilt. And sometimes it's family dynamics. There can be a sense of shame that pervades families, just the way we look at it ourselves. Maybe other people in the family act like that too. And we think, well, don't all families act like this? And then we wake up and see, oh no, there's a different way that I can be. When we're feeling this kind of neurotic guilt, this unhealthy guilt, we need to share with someone so that we can get out of the trap that says I am responsible for everything and that I have to make it all happen. Now, healthy guilt, this is when I recognize that I have wrongfully behaved and I need to reform. This kind of guilt causes growth. It helps me to recognize my need for God and that I am human and frail. It points to those places where I am living a less than full life. It helps us to embrace my full humanity, including those things that lead me into bad decisions. This kind of guilt leads to reconciliation and healing. It creates hope and compassion. It says, I am not God. I cannot save myself or anyone else. Only God saves. I am limited. I'm dependent upon others, and I cannot fulfill everyone's expectations, and disappointment is a fact of life. Healthy guilt is an openness to God's grace, and it's also an effect of God's grace, because ultimately it's there to help us to grow and to become a new and better person. I'd like to close with a forgiveness practice, a forgiveness meditation practice that I'd like to invite you to do. I invite you to simply to sit in a quiet place and open your heart to receiving God's love and mercy. To take a moment to just bask in it, enjoy it, and embrace it. And then ask God for a healing and compassionate heart. Allow yourself to hear God telling you that you are totally forgiven for all that you have done. God forgives you completely. And then close by responding to God as you wish. And with that, let's go into a moment of meditation.